Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you're listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we have Elizabeth Evans with us. She's received many grants and fellowships for her writing, including an NEA Fellowship, the James Michener Fellowship, and fellowships at Yaddo and MacDowell. She is the author of 6 books of fiction, the most recent being the novel As Good as Dead, which appeared in 2015. She is a professor emeritus at the U of A's program in creative writing, who has taught fiction writing for most of her adult life, periodically now at Queen's University Low Residency MFA program. She has been a writing resident at Centrum in Port Townsend and lives in Tucson, where she reports that the grapefruit from her tree stays nice really late into the year, and she has been eating the fruit warm from her tree. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Glad to be talking to you.
And I'm glad you're here and here in spirit, since you've been writing from Centrum at one point in your career. And I wondered maybe you could tell us about whether the climate up here was inspiring or helped you in any way, since it was different from where you're from, which we hear today is over 110.
Yeah, it's hot out there. I've been at Centrum, I think, three times. The last time I walked out of my cabin and I saw a familiar person walking down the road, and it was Sheila Bender. I have had a wonderful time being in Port Townsend. It is absolutely one of my favorite places in the world. Oh, gosh, I think there's part of me that probably my Scottish, English, Irish background that really responds to that wet, and I feel like go out walking in the wind, walk up in Fort Worden and just walk around the old battlements and feel very much in my element. So it's a special place for me. And I've been there in the summer and the spring and in the winter, but I haven't been in the fall. I'd like to go in the fall.
Well, you should, but it's good that you've been here in the winter, so you know that the early dark helps with creativity, right?
Yes.
Nothing to do but look inside and see what's cooking in our minds.
Or if you're in one of the Centrum cabins, maybe you can try to play the piano.
Well, that probably stimulates some writing. So I'm going to ask you if you were working on As Good as Dead, your newest novel, when you were here the last time.
I was not. I was working on something else, and then I got pulled away into writing the story that was the start of As Good as Dead. It was a story that I had been thinking about for about 20 years, actually. I'd heard a story from an older woman who told me she'd been asked to do a favor for a very old friend, and it was kind of an awful favor, and she had to decide what to do about it, and that had just stayed with me. And then I started making notes, and then I wrote the story, and Cutthroat published the story. I showed it to an editor who was interested in working with me, Nancy Miller at Bloomsbury, and she said, "Oh, I think this should be a novel." And Cutthroat had published that story. It was a 60-page story, and these are not easy to get published. So I think I could make that into a novel. I kept cutting things out, and it was wonderful. It was a wonderful thing. I got to actually make that story even longer and spend more time with the characters and figure out some things that made it richer and deeper.
And you worked with the same editor at Bloomsbury until the end there, when they published it?
Yes. She was the one who bought the story.
So that must have been fun.
Became the novel.
Yeah, fun to work with a person who recognized that it could be a novel and that was in sync with your own feelings as a writer.
Yeah, and she's somebody who had really liked my first novel, The Blue Hour, which was published a long time ago, and she'd kept in touch with me over the years and actually tried to buy another book, so she couldn't get her whole group on board for that one, but it was just nice to work with somebody who was an old fan, and I am a fan of hers as well.
So is she a writer as well, or are you a fan of her as an editor?
As as an editor. First came to know her. She was the editor of Rob Foreman Dew's first novel, Dale Loves Sophie to Death. And so there was this connection between the three of us.
Well, this sounds like
back.
A writer's dream, actually.
Yes, yeah.
So now that you've told us a little bit about the background of how the book, As Good as Dead, became a novel, would you read a little bit from it for us?
Oh, I'd love to. I was looking over this in anticipation of you asking, and I don't start in the very first pages, but pretty close to the first pages. I've got a little cutting here. So this is from the early pages of As Good as Dead. When Esme Cole Fletcher rang our doorbell that fall morning, an obnoxious thing, door drill was more like it, I jumped in my desk chair, swore. Telephones ringing, doorbells drilling. I always preferred to let my husband answer. Will was better at that sort of thing. And who could be at the front door anyway? Our house sat in an older part of Tucson that, although encircled by neighborhoods with sidewalks and lawns and paved streets, remained staunchly gravel roads, home to coyotes, gamble quail, and even the occasional long-tusked javelina. Apart from friends in a formal mood when they brought flowers or wine for a dinner party, the only people who used our front door were UPS drivers, evangelists, and those poor teenage boys lugging around styrofoam coolers of candy, whose profit each sweating kid swore by rote would keep him off the streets and away from a life of drugs and crime. Still, I got up. Will liked the living room drapes closed. I preferred them open, but was less consistent about carrying out my wishes, which was a boon that morning, since it allowed me to peek out at the caller from a slit between the panels. A stout, red-faced woman stood on our steps, boxy olive pantsuit, cropped hair the color of Vaseline. Partly turned away, she was just a profile with a single eye squinting against the Arizona sunshine. Impossible for me to have guessed that this was the Esme Cole who had been a student with me at the writer's workshop in 1988. My roommate in a brick apartment house on Burlington. That Esme had been stylish and slim in retro capris, vintage cashmere cardigans, a lovely 25-year-old with a bushel basket of red hair pinned up in a cloud of glorious dishevelment. Brave, I thought, wearing your hair that way, like keeping a swan for a pet and walking the thing around town, an announcement that you knew you were fabulous. Could the woman on the front steps be a Jehovah's Witness panting to hand over a copy of The Watchtower? But didn't witnesses travel in pairs and the ladies wear dresses? I didn't want to open the front door, but I worried over that Pepto-Bismol pink face and those blocky hands hanging so inert and glossy and red they could have been shrink-wrapped packs of hamburger. Suppose the woman was one of the poor souls discombobulated by the gravel roads that looked like driveways and driveways that looked like roads. Suppose she was looking for a lost pet, or worse, a lost child who'd wandered off into this semi-wilderness of cacti, rattlesnakes, the occasional grandfathered-in swimming pool with no proper safety fence around it. The bulky Esme Cole Fletcher, who stood on my front steps, looked so different that even after I opened the inner door and she said her name through the screen, I needed her teasing reprimand, "Charlotte, c'est moi," before a current began to flow between us. Weak at first, then that dull, chunky lady began to acquire a soft glow, and it was Esme. And joy is what I felt, alongside a dread that must have made my face go white. Yes, there had been lovely times between my workshop friend and myself, such as a morning when we knelt on our kitchen linoleum and dent by dent with our fingernails pressed our names, Charlotte, Esme, into the cupboard's many coats of built-up yellowed enamel. even better, once we finished, Esme added a plus sign between our names, Esme plus Charlotte, as if we were sweethearts. Also true, at the end of that year's Thanksgiving vacation, I spent an idiotic blotto evening sloshing around on the chilly waterbed of Esme's boyfriend, Jeremy Fletcher, whom I generally regarded as a giant blowhard. The worst thing I ever did in my entire life, betraying not only my friend, but also Will, off in Italy at the time. A thoroughly ridiculous person. That was what I had been.
Elizabeth, thank you. It makes us want to read the rest. And
thank you.
It makes me want to ask you this question. The premise of the novel, if we want to call it that, came from the story you heard from a woman who talked about having been asked to do a very unpleasant favor for a friend. So I'd like to know where your particular characters came from or how they arrived for you to tell a story that hinges on that favor idea.
The woman that I knew had definitely decided she would not do this thing, and she had no reason to feel obliged, other than friendship, old friendship, to carry out the favor. So I just was so haunted by her story, though, that someone making such a request, and I thought about the story. I'd make notes periodically. What about that story? And I thought, well, for the story to have power, there has to be a reason why the friend would consider possibly doing something really egregious. So I had to think, well, what would that be? We learned very early in the story this woman had betrayed her friend, and she's not quite sure. Did her friend know or not? And there's a lot that hinges on that. There was some kind of fear and sense of obligation, guilt, and I just thought of, all the many stories I knew from, I was a student at the Iowa Writers' Workshops, as these two characters are. And so I thought, there's a place where there's all kinds of competition and bed hopping, and that seemed like a wonderful place. The original story, the women were painters in graduate school together, and then I thought, I would really have fun writing a novel in which the narrator is a writer and actually a professor, and it allowed me not only to write this story about betrayal, but I also got to write about some of the things that I think about a lot and that I hope are very much in evidence in my own work, creating setting, and I have scenes where she's talking to her students about creating setting and the importance of setting and character development and so on. So that was this wonderful opportunity for me.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 Port Townsend. In case you've just joined us, you're listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Sheila is talking with Tucson novelist Elizabeth Evans about her writing career and her newest novel, Good as Dead.
Having read your book, I know that it is never didactic, even though there are lessons and thoughts about writing. It's a world that the reader just becomes immersed in, and it's the lives of these characters. It's not a didactic book at all. It's a wonderful story with lots of anticipation, and the place of Tucson and the remembered place in Iowa, is it Iowa City?
Yes, yeah. Iowa City.
Come through really strongly. So this idea of place as character is really strong in your work. I hope people will look at the book, and again, it's As Good as Dead, and it was just published last year. Would you tell us some more about your teaching? You say that it was fun to write the book because it was an avenue you use every day when you're talking with your students about writing. So what about your career as a teacher and a writer combined?
I find teaching very interesting, and I'm glad you say the book wasn't didactic, because I think as a teacher of writing, I tend not to be didactic because a lot of my own writing is very much by the seat of the pants. There's so many people who want to write, and they aren't doing it. I recommend a book. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. I just learned about it, called The War of Art. It's a book about resistance, and I think so much of getting a book done or a story written is, overcoming resistance, because it's hard work. I think it's hard work. It's the thing I love most to do in the world, but it's hard. And my big thing with students, and this has been my own feeling, if I work hard enough and long enough, eventually I'll get it. But the way that I think I built that confidence, and what I tell students, you build that confidence through reading so much good stuff. That gets in your veins. And you've got those sentences. It's not that you want to copy the book, but you get a sense of what good writing, the kind of satisfaction that you feel when you're reading good sentences and you hear wonderful rhythms and fine, exciting images and good structure. That gets into your blood. And then you can apply that to your own work.
I come across a lot of writing where people admire fabulous writers, and they actually at first can't tell the difference somehow, that their writing hasn't employed the strategies and language skill of the books they admire. And it's always interesting to me, that step people have to take to notice that what they wrote isn't finished, that what they wrote needs what you're calling work. It needs to be massaged and listened to and created. And it's a different thing than just writing and thinking it's finished. I don't know if you have any perceptions like this, but I've always been surprised at how so many people can't see that what they've created is not what they admire. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, it does. It does. And I do think a lot of my undergrad students haven't really done enough reading, and I think that's part of the problem. They may admire works, but they haven't really read enough to know why something works. I'm very much seat of the pants, so it's like just a feeling that this thing works. It satisfies, and I get that from my work. It has to be there. And I don't think of myself as a very confident person. I'm pretty shy, and I lost about half of my hearing when I was quite young. So I'm not real confident in social situations, but I have always been very confident in my judgment of my own writing and the books that I read. And I think it's just because of immersion in a way, that thing of learning to read your work as if you didn't write it, I think is just essential. I think it's also, for me, I don't know about you, Sheila, but I always read my stuff aloud.
Absolutely. It changes everything.
It changes everything. And it's really nice, too, if you can read your stuff aloud to some people, because sometimes you hear something else.
Even if they don't say anything, just knowing it's being received into their ears. Was that clear? Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think that it's important to have some readers, even if you're real confident in your work. For me, the big thing is, tell me if I'm not clear. Tell me if this is not clear, or if something feels forced. Because I may be very confident, but there are times when I find out something isn't clear to somebody, and clarity is just so important to me. It's probably the most important thing. I love beautiful language. I love wonderful images, but if things aren't clear, and the wrong word at the start of a sentence can throw readers off. Absolutely.
For the rest of the sentence. Learning that stuff is just...
So how do we learn it?
You got to write, and read like crazy, too. I think just a lot of people who want to write aren't writing enough. And this thing of reading aloud and hearing if there's some falseness in the work.
And by falseness, do you mean maybe that the writer's encroaching on the story and making it clear that a writer is writing it rather than allowing the story to be told?
You can feel sometimes like a story's being shoved around in ways that aren't natural. But I think I would first look for unearned feelings. You were mentioning you having students who feel they've written something that's really worked, and you see that they haven't gotten it yet. And I think a lot of times it's lack of development of the character and situation, and so the writer maybe wants to suggest that something big and important has happened at a particular moment, but the story hasn't developed sufficient gravitas for that to occur, so it feels forced or sentimental. And that's another thing, I really look for from readers, like, have I earned the right to this moment? And, of course, have I earned the story or book? You have to learn who is a good reader for your work, too. You get in a writing group, and you find, okay, so-and-so isn't the right reader for me, but this other person is. And it takes a while to find that little group.
It does, and it is a gut feeling that you have that someone is, even if they are finding problems in the work, they are the right reader, as opposed to somebody who says it's all great, might not be the right reader. So I want to ask you about beginnings. So you read to us from early in the book, and we have this outstanding description not only of what the woman at the door looks like, but also what the home of the writer looks like. We know a lot about her. We know about her husband. We know about the way he likes to keep the house dark, and she would prefer the drapes to be open. We know who usually comes at that time of day, that day of the week, to her house where she lives in Tucson. With that wonderful description of her hair, does that come to you all at once, or is it something that you go back and layer in, or you get to know the character more as you write?
Esme's hair, that came later. All of those things that you're talking about, they come over time. The book actually begins with this description of the chair that the woman is sitting in, and I felt like I wanted to get a lot of information into the reader's mind early, but as gracefully as possible. She's actually sitting on a chair that has several different things on it, her own writing. She's judging a contest. She's sitting on top of a manuscript from the contest. She's got some student work. So it's like a way of talking about all these different things that she does, and that she's a person who will sit down in a chair that's, covered with material that's part of her work. And, she's kind of uncomfortable, but she hasn't gotten up and moved the things. And like her husband having the curtains drawn, there's some tension between this couple, secrets, and she's kind of ignored some of those things. But right away, I'm trying to introduce a lot of things, but in such a way that the reader will pick them up, but not necessarily realize I'm picking this up and carrying it along with me. So it's more like it's just supposed to feel sort of seamless, and yet I'm trying to get the reader to carry along these things as he or she goes forward with the reading.
I think you've succeeded, and I think when we write, we often return to our beginnings because we know by the end of what we've written more about what we could put in the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
And I think people who read might not recognize that writing is done in layers and sessions and doesn't always come all at once. In fact, mostly it doesn't. But the strength of the story comes, the strength of the characters, and then we start to make it a shaped thing. And that can be very exciting.
And I think people sometimes think, oh, well, it's better if you didn't have to work on it.
Right.
And I know there's an example of some Flannery O'Connor story, which is one of her great stories. I think it might be Good Country People, or she said she wrote it in a morning. And I say to people, look, that's fabulous. Wow, what luck. Sometimes things come easily, but all that matters is what ends up in the reader's hands. So if it takes you 2 years to write a story, and it's a great story, that's just fine. That's just fine.
That's great advice. So we have to close our program soon, but I'd like to ask you if you could briefly tell us what's next for you in your writing.
I seem to be writing novellas, so I'm putting together a collection of very long stories, stories that are 75, 110 pages long. I'm finding I like that form. I'm a big Henry James fan, and I love his very long stories.
Well, it sounds
novellas,
like a little bit of a return to where As Good as Dead started, and I bet your editor will be very interested and have some interesting things to tell you. It's been wonderful to talk to you, Elizabeth, and to hear some of the inside scoop of writing a novel, and I hope we get to talk again soon.
Sure, that'd be great.
It would be.
And if anybody wants to write to me with questions, they can go to my website, elizabethevans.org, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So I'll say that again, elizabethevans.org. Thanks so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
You have been listening to In Conversation, Discussions on Writing and the Writing Life with Sheila Bender. For more of Sheila's interviews, please go to Sheila's website, www.writingitreal.com/audio.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman. Announcer is Kurt Vanderslice.